Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number for PC, Mac, Linux, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, and PS Vita. This review is coming to you courtesy of the Supernatural Muffin. He sent me this, so thank you, it is greatly appreciated. This is a top-down action game and the sequel to Hotline Miami. It was developed by Dennaton Games and published by Devolver Digital in March of this year for PC, Mac, and Linux, and it later saw release on PS3, PS4, and PS Vita. It was also met with quite a lot of critical acclaim. People seem to generally like it quite a lot, except for occasional reviews here and there. And it also was met with some controversy because of one particular scene in the game that got the game banned in Australia, which is that it's implied sexual assault, only it's not actually depicted in the game, because as soon as it happens, you see the director yell, "Cut," and it turns out it was just a movie all along. But of course, you know how people are with that sort of thing, and obviously people just flew off the handle at it, even though you don't even have to experience it, because Dennaton ended up putting in a setting that lets you skip that bit entirely. So people were just throwing all sorts of crazy, ridiculous nonsense around for really no reason. And honestly, out of all the things that is shown in Hotline Miami 2, that's the one thing people freak out over. Not the fact that you can bash people's brains in with a pipe and watch them splatter all over the place, or that you can disembowel people with a chainsaw. Nope, gotta be the one thing that they don't explicitly show. Anyway, enough about that. The real question here is, how is this as a game, and how is it as a sequel to the original Hotline Miami? Because I really did enjoy the original Hotline Miami, even though it was incredibly frustrating at times. And it had a very unique style to it. How has this thing carried forth the Hotline Miami style, if it has at all, and how has it expanded upon the original game? Well, as far as presentation goes, it's pretty much the same as the original Hotline Miami, but they have improved some various aspects to some degree. For example, the sprite work is pretty much exactly the same style as it was in the original game, but they put more detail into, in particular, the gore effects. Like, now you can decapitate enemies and their heads will go rolling around on the ground and things like that. So they added in some nice visual touches, and they made the gore more detailed and things like that. But more or less, it's pretty much the same kind of thing you would expect after having played the original Hotline Miami. The sound design is also pretty similar to the original Hotline Miami in that most of the sound effects are either just in the same style as the previous game, where they're fairly utilitarian, or they are straight up from the original game. For example, the shotgun sounds or things like that. So it's all very familiar in that regard. Like in the original game, there's also no voice acting, so that leaves only one aspect of the presentation to go over, which is the soundtrack, which, like the original game, is absolutely fantastic. There's not only tracks from familiar artists like Moon or El Cuervo or Perturbator or any number of people like that, but they also bring in some new tracks from the likes of Carpenter Brute and so on. And one in particular, Roller Mobster, is particularly memorable in its context, as it's gone through a gauntlet. It's a level where you actually play basically 5 levels in one, and it's suitably intense for the situation. So, once again, the soundtrack in this game is absolutely phenomenal and lends a lot to this game. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this takes place both before and after the events of the original Hotline Miami. And it starts off with after the events of the original Hotline Miami, where Jacket is now actually being brought to trial for his deeds. And the game starts out with a slasher film featuring the character of the Pig Butcher, and it goes from there to various other characters throughout the course of the game. In the current day stuff, it's mostly concerning the fans, who are 5 characters who are basically emulating what Jacket did in the original game, where they're going around and just killing mobsters and such like that, wearing masks, using their various abilities, which I'll get to in a moment. But it also jumps around to other characters like the Soldier, who is fighting a losing war in Hawaii over the island against the Russians. And he's part of a Special Forces detachment for that. It's actually set long before the events of the original Hotline Miami. It's set in basically 5 or so years before. And it's detailing what leads up to what you get in Hotline Miami 2, why people are so vehemently anti-Russian and things like that. But it also jumps to other characters as well. For example, the writer, who is basically chronicling what exactly Jacket was doing, why he was doing it, that sort of thing. You've got Detective Pardo, who is on the trail of a serial killer in Miami and just goes on these rampages against various mobsters while he's doing it. And there's also a couple of other characters who you run into more later in the game, but I'm not really going to spoil those. The thing is, the game tries to fill in what the original Hotline Miami left out, and for good reason. You see, the plot in the original game came across as something like the movie Drive. It was a pretty self-contained thing. It didn't really need any extraneous lore or anything like that, and it worked rather well for what it was, which was a pretty simplistic crime story mixed in with the aspect of basically Jacket going insane. And it worked really well for the game. It was unsettling, it was trippy, and it had a very unique feel. When you get to Hotline Miami 2, you can't get attached to any of the characters because it really jumps around way too much, and the attempts to really fill out the backstory to Hotline Miami and expand upon what's going on around Miami as you're playing through the game really don't do anything to really grab you and hold your interest. There are a few moments here and there that are alright, but you don't really feel like you're playing Hotline Miami as much as you're playing a game that is based on Hotline Miami, which is kind of weird. And it really doesn't help that by the time you get to the end of the game, it's actually a longer game than the original Hotline Miami, and the ending is considerably less satisfying and frankly just kind of goes insane. So what ends up happening with the plot of the game is that it ends up being a convoluted, jumbled mess that feels like it's complicated for the sake of being complicated instead of really trying to make Hotline Miami a richer experience by expanding upon it. But if this issue only resulted in the plot not being particularly interesting, which is what happens, then it would be excusable to some degree. I would be able to look past that and go into the gameplay. So that brings up the question, well, how is the gameplay? Well, in a way, it's more of the same. If you've played Hotline Miami, this is all going to be very familiar to you. It's still an extremely intense top-down action game where you pick up various weapons throughout the levels, whether they be guns or knives or baseball bats or whatever it may well be, and you eviscerate your foes. They all pretty much die in one hit except for a couple of them, and you die in one hit. So it's all, of course, very fast-paced, very intense, and at times it can be very, very frustrating, like the original game. Where it fails is how they changed up the way you actually play the game. You see, the original Hotline Miami had one character that you were playing as throughout the entirety of the game, which was Jacket. And Jacket would put on these various masks that would each give him a different ability. For example, one of them made your punches lethal, one of them basically starts you off with a gun, things like that. And it was a combined style of a sort of brawler and top-down shooter that worked rather well for what it was. Hotline Miami 2, on the other hand, has these various masks that very much determine your playstyle. For example, with the fans, when you select a mask, it selects an entire character as opposed to just a mask that you decide to wear as your character and you have all the same abilities, basically. For example, when you play as the fans in the various levels that they are included in, you get to choose between one of the various characters. The closest thing to a normal character in that particular instance is Gore, who has the ability to do a dodge roll that allows him to completely avoid incoming fire as long as he's still rolling while it crosses over him, and be able to get in there nice and close so he can just cut people up pretty easily and things like that. But other than the dodge roll, he plays exactly as you would expect after having played the previous Hotline Miami game, where he's just a pretty standard playstyle. He can pick up pretty much any weapon and just use it to his heart's content. But then there's Alex and Ash and Tony. Tony has the Fists of Fury ability from the original game, where punches are now lethal, But he can't use weapons at all. Not a single one. So while he does get lethal punches, he can no longer pick up a gun and use it, which becomes a problem that I will explain in a moment. That said, he does get the ability to actually take out heavies with melee, so that's a good thing, but it is extremely limiting. And that's something that is not a good thing in Hotline Miami. Hotline Miami is really all about flexibility, and when you start throwing in a lot of very limiting factors, it becomes problematic. But again, I'll get to that in a moment. I mentioned Alex and Ash. They are actually one character, but they're two characters in one, so to speak. It's kind of weird. One of them has a chainsaw and can never have anything else. The other one has a gun. And they start out with a pistol, but they can also pick up other guns as they go through the level, and if they run out of ammo for their first one anyway, so they just pick up whatever's on the ground and go from there. But the thing is, you really control the one with the chainsaw. That's the one that you need to worry about, because that's the only one that can actually take damage. And that's the one you're moving around. The one with the gun just kind of follows that character around, and you control them with the mouse in terms of aiming and shooting. And it's really awkward to get used to, but even once you get used to it, you have the problem of the second character getting stuck on walls and things like that, and you'll get separated. Or you'll try to move them through a door and they'll get stuck, and then it turns out there's gun-wielding enemies on the other side, and you need to use the gun character to actually be able to take them out, but you can't. There's also ways to cheese the AI with this set of characters, but that's beside the point as well. And then there's also one other character who has the dual submachine guns that can actually be spread. So instead of just firing straight forward, you can hold the right mouse button and he will actually move his arms to the sides and be able to shoot in two directions, which is kind of cool, but ultimately not all that practical. I almost never used it, so that's worth noting. And while these characters give you some flexibility on the levels that they're on the levels they're not on, you have to deal with whatever it throws at you. And this can be problematic for a couple of them. Namely, the soldier, who has a gun and a knife and nothing else. You can't pick up any weapons as you're going through the levels. You only have your knife and whatever gun you picked. So if you run out of ammo, you need to go find an ammo crate, and it'll only give you a couple of bullets. So it's kind of irritating to play as the soldier until you get access to the really good weapons later on in the game, and by then the level design becomes a problem for that character, but again, I'll get to that in a moment. There's also two characters that can switch between three different playstyles, and they're basically just recycling things from either the original Hotline Miami or, more notably, from the fans. So they're really not all that interesting and really different from what you've seen before. But then there's the couple of characters that you get to play as who play exactly the same as the original Hotline Miami. And those are the bits where the game shines. Because this thing basically takes what Hotline Miami did and expands upon it. It adds different weapons, it adds different enemy types and things like that. So when you're still able to be very flexible like you could be in the original Hotline Miami, the game gets a chance to really shine, and it really does feel like you're playing a continuation of Hotline Miami. But here's the problem. Those are very few and far between. Most of the time you're playing as a character who has a gimmick. And on occasion that can actually grind your game to a screeching halt, because they actually pretty much built this entire game around guns this time around. There are so many levels that are just huge, and you cannot see enemies that are actually able to see you and shoot at you from basically across the map. And so you'll end up dying over and over and over again to enemies you can't see. And so you just kind of have to spray bullets in their general direction and hope that one of them hits them. It doesn't help that so many enemies in this game are actually gun wielders as well. So you will just run into so many enemies who will just snipe you from across the room before you can even get close enough to hit them. And it ultimately ends up severely limiting your playstyle. If you wanted to play as Tony, for example, it's pretty much a terrible idea because he has to basically cheese the AI in order to really be effective. And that's something you will notice about this game. more often than not, you do not do what you were doing in the original Hotline Miami, which is just kind of run through levels as quickly as you can, being as flexible as possible. In Hotline Miami 2, you end up being pretty much forced to play more cautiously if you want to actually be able to win. The problem with that is that the score system still encourages the original Hotline Miami style of play, being fast, being flexible, and ultimately doing what would be completely reckless in this game, which is go for high combos that involve lots of different weapons and such like that. So the really weird thing about it is that it feels like it's actively punishing you for playing it like Hotline Miami. There were so many levels where I had to follow a very specific pattern in order to actually be able to beat it. There were levels where I had to just deliberately wait and cheese the AI in order to actually be able to win. And it doesn't help that because the game is longer and more drawn out, the flaws that were present in the original game but largely could be overlooked are just on full display here. Namely because the level design in this game is a lot worse, the AI being completely inconsistent with how it actually gets triggered, where you can fire a shotgun and enemies in the next room will not notice, but enemies across the map will, and some enemies will just get stuck moving in circles. You'll try to move through something and you'll actually get stuck on a door. You'll have wonky hit detection where sometimes an enemy will even hit you and it will not instantly kill you and you're not sure how. And any number of things like that just bring the game down. Like I said, you could overlook a lot of these flaws when the levels were as small and tightly designed as the original Hotline Miami's. But when you open up that level design and you throw in a lot more guns, it becomes way more readily apparent and outright irritating. And that's really the emotion I felt most while playing this thing. When I played the original Hotline Miami, it was a somewhat unsettling but incredibly satisfying experience because you had this very high risk-reward combat system that was unique, and it really did reward you for being good at the game. When you get to Hotline Miami 2, it feels like it's just kind of slapping you in the face most of the time. And I actually got so preoccupied with that when the game attempted to do the same thing that the original did, which was try to unsettle the player with this kind of gratuitous violence and everything, it actually failed because I was so incredibly frustrated with the gameplay. That's something that never really happened in the original Hotline Miami, and it really bothers me with Hotline Miami 2. Add to that the fact that the plot ends up being really uninteresting for the most part, and frankly kind of irritating at times when it's constantly jumping back and forth and leaving you confused and needing a timeline really just to keep track of what the hell's going on. It just ultimately becomes an incredibly disappointing experience, where on occasion you get these gleams of what could have been. You get these gleams of a bolder, better Hotline Miami with a more intricately focused storytelling style. But in Hotline Miami 2, the story is too convoluted to really benefit from this tighter storytelling. The level design is a lot worse and leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to flexibility because you're going to be forced to use guns half the time. And that's just irritating. I mean, the original game did that too to some degree when it threw heavies at you, but in this game, not only does it throw heavies at you, but it throws all these enemies where you can really only get to them by shooting at them because they're too far away and they will instantly spot you and shoot at you if you try to do anything. As well as just technical problems that the game has, like I said, with the second character when you're playing Alex and Ash getting stuck on the environment, or you yourself getting stuck on the environment, any number of things like that just make the game incredibly frustrating to play. At least there's a level editor, and at least the soundtrack in the game is fantastic, and on occasion it has those moments of, well, this is what it should be. But there's just too much in this thing where it falls short of what it could have been, and frankly, should have been. I give it a 2.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.